You really thought buying that dump would make you one of us? The words cut through the still morning air, sharp enough to turn heads from manicured lawns and polished driveways. A few neighbors chuckled under their breath. Others didn't bother hiding their smirks as they stared at the cracked siding and overgrown weeds surrounding the cheapest house on the block. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because what looked like a poor decision wasn't one at all. Not even close. He didn't argue, didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the woman standing across the street in her tailored suit, her sunglasses reflecting his so-called mistake. Instead, the single dad just knelt in the dirt and kept digging, and none of them, not a single one, understood why that mattered. The man's name was Ethan Call. He moved with a quiet precision that didn't match the worn boots on his feet or the faded work shirt clinging to his back. While the others watched with judgment, he focused on the soil beneath his hands, brushing it aside carefully, almost methodically. Like he wasn't just planting something, he was searching. Behind him, his daughter sat cross-legged on the front steps, sketchbook balanced on her knees. Lily didn't seem bothered by the whispers or the stares. She'd learned, long before this neighborhood, that people always had something to say when they didn't understand you. "Dad," she called softly, tilting her head, "you're digging in the same spot again." Ethan paused. Not startled, just aware. "Yeah," he replied, voice calm, almost absent-minded. "Ground feels different here." Different. It wasn't the kind of word anyone else would have used. To them, dirt was dirt. A backyard was just a backyard. But the way he pressed his palm flat against the soil, eyes narrowing slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear, it felt deliberate. Intentional. Across the street, Marianne Voss lowered her sunglasses just enough to study him more closely. "This is exactly what I warned the board about," she said, loud enough for the nearby residents to hear. Property values don't just drop on their own, they're dragged down. A ripple of agreement passed through the small crowd that had gathered, neighbors drawn not by concern, but by curiosity, by spectacle. Ethan didn't respond. He simply stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, and glanced briefly toward the row of pristine houses lining the street. The symmetry, the polished stone, the flawless landscaping, all of it sat on ground no one questioned. Except him. "Dad," Lily said again, quieter this time, "are we staying here?" That question carried weight. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. The kind that came from moving too many times, from watching doors close just as quickly as they opened. Ethan looked at her then, really looked. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "We are." No hesitation, no explanation, just certainty. And that certainty did something strange. It lingered. Hung in the air longer than it should have, like a note played just slightly out of tune. Marianne crossed the street, heels clicking against the pavement with controlled authority. She stopped just short of Ethan's property line, careful not to step onto the uneven grass. "You'll be receiving a formal notice," she said, her tone smooth but firm. "There are standards here, expectations. This," she gestured vaguely toward the house, "doesn't meet them." Ethan met her gaze, not confrontational, not submissive, just steady. "House past inspection," he replied simply. Marianne smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Inspections can be incomplete. There it was. Not a threat exactly, but close enough. A few neighbors leaned in slightly, sensing something more beneath the exchange. Power, maybe, or the quiet testing of it. Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than accepting a warning. "Maybe," he said. And that was it. No argument, no defense, just that same calm, unshaken presence that somehow made the silence afterward feel heavier than any words could have. Lily stood then, brushing dust from her dress, and walked over to him. She slipped her hand into his, small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones with instinctive trust. "We should finish before it gets dark," she said. He glanced down at her, then back at the patch of earth he'd been digging. "Yeah," he murmured, "we should." But even as he picked up the shovel again, his attention shifted, not just to the ground beneath him, but beyond it. Past the fence line, past the street, toward something deeper, something hidden. And for just a second, barely noticeable, his expression changed. Not fear, not worry, recognition, as if he'd seen this before, as if he already knew what was coming. Recognition didn't leave his face when he drove the shovel back into the soil. If anything, it settled deeper, like a memory he couldn't ignore, and wouldn't. The metal edge struck something beneath the surface, not rock, not roots, something hollow. The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the earth, but his grip tightened instantly. He froze, then slowly crouched, brushing away dirt with his bare hands again. Careful, controlled, listening more than looking. Across the street, Marianne hadn't moved. She watched him the way people watched problems, calculating distance, deciding whether to confront or contain. Around her, a few neighbors lingered longer than they needed to, pretending to adjust hedges or check their mailboxes while their attention stayed fixed on the man who didn't seem to understand his place. "Unbelievable," one of them muttered. "He's digging like he's building a bunker." Marianne exhaled sharply, folding her arms. "He won't last a week," she said. "They never do," but even as she said it, her eyes narrowed slightly, because there was something about the way he moved, something that didn't match the narrative she'd already written for him. Back on the lawn, Ethan uncovered a narrow strip of metal, rusted, partially buried, running at an angle beneath his yard. He didn't pull it free, didn't even touch it at first. He just stared. Then his gaze shifted, slowly tracking the line it formed beneath the ground, past his property line toward the neighboring houses. His jaw tightened. "Dad?" Lily's voice pulled him back. She stepped closer, peering down at the exposed piece. "What is it?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because of how much he knew. "Old pipe," he said finally, brushing dirt over part of it again. "Probably nothing. Probably nothing." But the way he said it, quiet, measured, didn't match the words. Lily studied him for a second longer, then nodded. She trusted him. Always had. "Can I help?" she asked. He offered a small smile. "You already are." That was enough for her. She returned to the steps, flipping open her sketchbook again, though her eyes drifted back to him more often now. Across the street, Marianne turned away. "This is getting handled today," she said to one of the residents beside her. "I'm calling an emergency HO meeting." "Already?" the man asked. She didn't slow down. Standards don't enforce themselves. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she walked off, the sound echoing longer than it should have. Ethan watched her go. Not with annoyance, not even frustration, just awareness. Then he looked back down at the ground. And this time, he didn't dig randomly. He measured. Steps counted under his breath. Angles checked with nothing but instinct and memory. Each movement deliberate, each placement precise. The kind of precision that didn't come from guesswork, but from training. From experience, from knowing exactly what lay beneath the surface, because you'd seen what happened when people ignored it. A breeze passed through the street, rustling the perfectly trimmed hedges. Somewhere, a distant car door slammed. Life continued, unchanged on the surface. But under that calm, something shifted. Not visibly, not yet, but enough for him to feel it. By late afternoon, the neighborhood clubhouse filled quickly. Polished wood floors, glass walls reflecting golden sunlight, a long table where Marianne stood at the head, tablet in hand, posture flawless as always. "This won't take long," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "We've had multiple complaints regarding property violations, specifically Lot 17. A few heads nodded, some exchanged knowing looks. Overgrowth, unauthorized digging, structural concerns," she continued, listing them like charges. "Structural?" someone asked. Marianne didn't hesitate. "Any alteration to land without approval creates risk. Risk." The word hung there, heavy, but not for the reason she intended. Because at that exact moment, outside, Ethan pressed his palm flat against the ground again. Still, silent. Then, a faint tremor, barely noticeable. A vibration more than a movement. But his eyes sharpened instantly. "Lily," he called, not raising his voice, but firm. She looked up. "Yeah, inside. Now, no explanation, no panic, just certainty. And that was enough." She closed her sketchbook without question and hurried inside the house. Ethan stayed where he was, watching, listening, counting something no one else could see. Back in the clubhouse, Marianne finished her statement. "We'll be issuing a formal eviction notice effective immediately," she said. "This community," a subtle shake interrupted her, just enough to rattle the glass slightly. The room went quiet. "Did you feel that?" someone whispered. Marianne straightened. Probably construction nearby, but outside, Ethan's expression didn't change. Because he knew exactly what it was. And more importantly, he knew it wasn't going to stop. If you're starting to feel like something's not adding up, make sure you're subscribed, because this is where everything begins to shift. You're not wrong. Because outside, the ground didn't settle. It held that faint, uneasy vibration, like something deep beneath the neighborhood was shifting, testing its limits. Ethan stood completely still, boots planted firmly in the soil, his attention locked on the subtle tremor most people would have ignored. To anyone watching, he looked calm, maybe even passive. But inside, calculations were already running. Distance, pressure, direction. Patterns he hadn't thought about in years, now rising back to the surface with alarming clarity. He exhaled slowly, then turned toward the house. "Stay by the door," he said to Lily as he stepped inside briefly. She nodded, clutching her sketchbook tighter than usual. "Is it bad?" He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because the truth wasn't simple. "It could be," he said finally. "But we're ahead of it." Ahead of it. That phrase lingered in her mind as he stepped back outside, already scanning the street again. Across the road, one of the neighbors had stepped out of his house, frowning as he looked down at his driveway. A thin crack had appeared, barely visible, but new. "Hey," the man called out, crouching to inspect it. "This wasn't here this morning." Another door opened. Then another. Curiosity spread quickly in places like this, especially when perfection started to slip. Within minutes, several residents stood outside their homes, murmuring, pointing, comparing notes. "Probably the heat," someone suggested. "Or bad concrete," another added. Excuses came easily when reality felt inconvenient. But Ethan didn't look at the cracks. He looked beyond them. Tracing invisible lines beneath the ground, connecting what others saw as isolated flaws into something far more dangerous. His gaze shifted toward the slope at the far end of the neighborhood, a subtle incline most people barely noticed. But he did, and the way his shoulders tensed said everything. Back inside the clubhouse, Marianne had already regained control of the room. "It's nothing," she stated firmly, brushing off the brief tremor as if it had never happened. "Let's stay focused." A few hesitant nods followed. People wanted to believe her. It was easier that way. Now, as I was saying. A louder sound interrupted her this time, not a shake. A sharp crack. The kind that echoed. The room fell silent again. One of the residents near the glass wall turned slowly, eyes widening as he looked outside. "There's something happening out there." Marianne's jaw tightened. She walked toward the window, each step measured, controlled. But when she reached the glass, her composure faltered just for a second, because the street no longer looked perfect. Hairline fractures now stretched across multiple driveways. One of the decorative stone pathways had shifted unevenly, and in the center of it all, Ethan stood exactly where he had been. Not surprised, not confused. Prepared. Back outside, the murmurs had turned into uneasy silence. The man who'd first noticed the crack straightened slowly, brushing dust from his hands. "This doesn't look right," he admitted. No one argued this time, because deep down they could all feel it now. Something wasn't stable. Something was wrong. Ethan stepped forward, finally closing the distance between himself and the group. They noticed him immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because of the way he carried himself. Steady, grounded, certain. "You should step back from the driveways," he said calmly. A few people blinked at him, caught off guard by the tone, not forceful, but firm enough to cut through the noise. "Excuse me?" One woman replied, clearly irritated. "And why exactly would we?" "Because the ground underneath isn't holding evenly," he interrupted, not raising his voice, but leaving no room for debate. That did it. The group went quiet, not convinced, but unsettled. "What are you talking about?" the first man asked, glancing down again. Ethan pointed, not at the crack itself, but along its path. "Look at the direction," he said. "It's not random." A few heads tilted, eyes followed the line more carefully this time, and slowly realization began to creep in. The fractures weren't scattered, they were connected, leading somewhere. Marianne stepped out of the clubhouse just then, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. "What is going on here?" she demanded. Relief flickered across a few faces. Authority had arrived. Control would follow. At least that's what they expected. Ethan turned toward her. For the first time, their roles felt less defined. "The ground's shifting," he said simply. Marianne scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" 2 words. Calm, direct. But they landed heavier than anything else said so far, because now everyone was looking at the cracks, and no one was laughing anymore. A low rumble followed, deeper this time. Not loud, but undeniable. And beneath their feet, something moved again. The movement didn't stop this time. It lingered, subtle but undeniable, like the ground itself was breathing beneath their feet. A few people instinctively stepped back, shoes scraping against stone and pavement. The earlier confidence, the casual dismissal, it was gone now, replaced by something quieter, heavier, uncertainty. Marianne held her ground. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the rumble faded into an uneasy stillness. But the tightness in her jaw gave her away. The slight hesitation before she spoke again. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, her voice sharper now. Minor settling happens all the time in new developments. But no one answered her. Because now they could see it. One of the luxury homes across the street, pristine just hours ago, had developed a jagged crack along the edge of its front steps. Small, but fresh. And growing. Ethan didn't look at Marianne. He looked at the house, then at the ground beneath it, then beyond it, tracing something invisible again. "Everyone needs to move away from the foundations," he said louder this time, not commanding but urgent enough to cut through the tension. A man near the cracked steps hesitated. "Is it dangerous?" Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. "It's getting there, that was enough." People started moving. Slowly at first, then faster, stepping back onto the street, away from walls, away from anything that touched the ground too firmly. Except Marianne. She stepped forward instead. "This is unnecessary panic," she snapped, her gaze locking onto him. "You don't get to walk in here, tear up your yard, and suddenly act like you understand structural integrity better than the people who built this neighborhood." There it was again. That line. That assumption. Ethan finally met her eyes fully. "I'm not acting," he said. Simple. Flat. But something about it made the air shift again, not physically this time, but socially. Because doubt had entered the room. Not about him, about her. "You're a contractor," she continued, her voice tightening. "A handyman at best, and now you're diagnosing entire properties?" A few neighbors glanced between them, caught in the middle of something they didn't fully understand anymore. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He crouched instead, right there in the street, and pressed his palm flat against the asphalt. The same motion, the same stillness. Listening. A car alarm chirped faintly in the distance. Wind brushed through the trees. Someone shifted nervously behind him. And then, a sharper tremor. This one visible. The cracked steps across the street shifted again, just slightly, but enough to send a small piece of stone breaking loose and sliding downward. A woman gasped. "Okay, that's not normal," someone said quickly. Now Marianne stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough. Ethan stood slowly. "It's not surface level," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever's happening is underneath all of this." He gestured, not just to the street, but to the entire stretch of homes. Connected. The word settled heavily. A man near the curb shook his head. "That doesn't make sense, the inspections." "Inspections check what's visible," Ethan interrupted quietly. "They don't always catch what's buried." And there it was again, that subtle shift. People weren't arguing anymore. They were listening. Marianne noticed it too. And she didn't like it. "This is speculation," she said firmly, stepping forward again as if reclaiming space. "And it's dangerous. You're scaring people without evidence." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You want evidence?" He turned, pointing toward the far end of the neighborhood, the slight slope he'd been watching since morning. "Look there." At first, nothing seemed different. Then, a faint line appeared, cutting across the pavement. Slow, subtle, but spreading right before their eyes. No one spoke, no one moved, because now it wasn't theoretical. It was happening. Marianne's composure cracked, not outwardly, not in a way she'd admit, but enough for the silence around her to feel louder than anything she could say. Ethan stepped forward again, closer to the center of the street. "This doesn't stop on its own," he said. "And if we ignore it—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the ground answered for him. Another low rumble rolled beneath them, longer this time, deeper. And somewhere, just out of sight, something shifted, and this time it wasn't subtle. A deep, grinding sound rolled beneath the neighborhood, like stone dragging against stone far below the surface. The ground didn't just tremble, it moved. A sharp crack echoed from the far end of the street. Heads snapped toward it. One of the larger homes, the kind with tall columns and imported stone, jerked slightly to one side. Not enough to collapse, but enough to make it real. "Everyone back." Ethan's voice cut through the rising panic, stronger now, carrying authority he hadn't shown before. This time, no one questioned him. People moved. Fast. Shoes scraped, doors slammed. Someone shouted for their kids. The illusion of control, the polished, perfect calm of the neighborhood, shattered in seconds. Marianne stood frozen for a moment, staring at the house that had just shifted. Her house. "No," she whispered under her breath. The front steps of her property cracked straight down the center. Clean. Violent. For the first time, she looked unsure. Ethan moved past her without hesitation, scanning the street, the slope, the lines forming beneath the ground like invisible fractures spreading outward. "It's following the fault," he said, mostly to himself. Then louder, "Everyone away from the slope. Stay in the center of the road, don't go near the edges." A man grabbed his arm. "What do we do? Call someone? Engineers? The city?" Ethan shook his head slightly. By the time they get here, he didn't finish. Because he knew, and something in his tone made the man let go. Behind them, another crack split across a driveway. Then another. The pattern was clearer now, branching, connecting, spreading like veins beneath the neighborhood. Lily stood near the doorway of their house, watching everything unfold, her sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest. "Dad," she called. He turned immediately. Inside, now. But Lily. Just her name. Firm, certain. She nodded and disappeared inside without another word. Ethan exhaled once, then turned back to the street. Everything was accelerating. Marianne stepped toward him again, but this time there was no arrogance in her movement. No control. "What is happening?" she demanded, her voice strained now, not sharp. Ethan looked at her, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just clarity. "The ground underneath your neighborhood wasn't reinforced properly," he said. "There's a structural gap. Something failed below the surface." Her eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible. This development passed every visible inspection," he cut in. The same words as before. But now, they landed differently, because the evidence was all around them. Another rumble hit, stronger. A section of decorative stone near the slope collapsed inward slightly, revealing a hollow space beneath. Not deep, but enough to expose something darker below. A void. Someone screamed. Okay, this is bad." A man shouted, backing away quickly. Ethan moved toward the collapse point, ignoring the shouts behind him. He crouched near the edge, careful, calculating the stability with each step. The air felt different here. Cooler, unnatural. He picked up a loose fragment of stone and dropped it gently into the exposed gap. It didn't land immediately. A beat. Then, a hollow echo. Too deep. His jaw tightened. "Yeah," he murmured under his breath. Behind him, Marianne followed, hesitant, but drawn by something stronger than fear. "What does that mean?" she asked. Ethan stood, brushing dust from his hands. "It means this isn't surface damage," he said. "There's a cavity underneath, and it's spreading." Her face drained of color. "A sinkhole?" "Not exactly." He looked out across the neighborhood again, tracing the lines, the slope, the fractures connecting everything together. "Something worse," he said quietly. That silence hit harder than any explanation, because now they knew he understood it. And they didn't. If you've made it this far and you're starting to realize how fast things can fall apart, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happens next changes everything. Another crack split the pavement. Louder this time. Closer. Right down the middle of the street, people stumbled back, some nearly losing their balance as the ground shifted unevenly beneath them. Ethan stepped forward again, toward the center, toward the fracture. Not away from it. Never away. He crouched once more, pressing his hand against the asphalt, eyes closing briefly as if listening to something far deeper than sound. And then, his eyes opened. Sharp. Focused. Certain. "It's not just collapsing," he said. Marianne swallowed. "Then what is it?" Ethan stood slowly, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "It's failing," he said, and it's already too far along to stop the way you think. It's failing, he said. The word didn't just describe the ground beneath them, it settled over the entire neighborhood like a verdict. No one argued this time. They couldn't, because the evidence wasn't subtle anymore. The fracture running down the middle of the street widened slightly, a thin gap turning into something darker, deeper. Dust trickled into it, disappearing faster than it should have. A woman grabbed her husband's arm. "We need to leave, right now." "Where?" Someone else shot back. "If it's everywhere, where do we go?" Panic was spreading now. Not loud, not chaotic yet, but close. Ethan stepped away from the crack, scanning the entire stretch again. His mind wasn't reacting, it was calculating. Every movement of the ground, every shift in pressure, every subtle angle in the slope, it all fit together. Too well. He turned back toward the group. "Listen to me," he said, louder now. "The center of the road is the most stable point. For now, stay together. Don't go back inside the houses." A man frowned. "But our stuff, our stuff doesn't matter," Ethan cut in. "Weight distribution does. Foundations are already compromised. If one section gives..." A sharp crack interrupted him again. This one closer. Right beneath one of the parked luxury cars. The vehicle shifted slightly, tilting just enough to send a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Okay. The man threw his hands up. Fine. Now they listened. Not because they trusted him yet, but because nothing else made sense anymore. Marianne stood just off to the side, her usual composure unraveling piece by piece. She looked at her home again, the fractured steps, the subtle lean that hadn't been there this morning. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Ethan heard her, but didn't respond. Instead, he walked back toward his yard. Fast, focused. "Where are you going?" Someone called after him. Getting ahead of it, he replied without stopping. He grabbed a set of tools from beside the porch, simple things. Rope, a metal rod, markers he'd already placed earlier. That detail didn't go unnoticed anymore. "Wait," one of the neighbors said slowly. "You already had this stuff set up?" Ethan didn't answer directly. He drove the metal rod into the ground at a specific point near the edge of his property, checking resistance, angle, depth. Then another, and another, each placement precise. Each movement efficient, not guessing, knowing. Marianne stepped closer again, her voice tighter now, not from authority but from something else. "How are you doing that?" she asked. "How do you know where to place those?" Ethan paused briefly, glancing at the line of rods forming along the yard. "They show me how fast it's spreading," he said. Her brow furrowed. "You've done this before, it wasn't a question." Ethan didn't deny it. But he didn't confirm it either. Instead, he looked out across the neighborhood again, and this time, his expression hardened. Everyone moved 10 feet back, he called out suddenly. The urgency in his tone hit different now. Immediate. Non-negotiable. People hesitated, just for a second. Then the ground answered for him. A low, violent rumble surged beneath them, stronger than anything before. The central crack widened sharply, splitting open another inch in seconds. Move. This time they didn't wait. The entire group stumbled backward, some nearly falling over each other as they rushed away from the expanding fracture. A section of pavement near the slope dropped slightly, just enough to reveal more of the hollow darkness beneath. The void was growing. And fast. Ethan stepped forward again, but not recklessly, carefully. Calculating each step like the ground itself was a puzzle he'd solved before. Because it was. He crouched near one of the rods he'd placed, watching it shift ever so slightly in the soil, tracking it, measuring it. Then he stood, and finally, finally, he turned back to them. Not as the man they'd mocked, not as the outsider, but as the only one who understood what they were standing on. "This isn't random," he said. "It's following a buried line, something that was already unstable before any of these houses were built." A man shook his head. "Then why didn't anyone catch it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Because no one wanted to look that deep, the answer landed hard. Because suddenly, this wasn't just an accident. It was something worse. Something ignored. Marianne swallowed, her voice barely steady now. "Can it be fixed?" Ethan looked at the ground again, the cracks, the void, the pattern unfolding exactly the way he'd feared. Then he looked back at her. And this time, there was no softness in his answer. "Not the way it should have been," he said. A pause. Then, quieter. "But I can slow it down." Those words didn't bring relief, they brought reality. Because slowing something down meant it was already too far gone to stop. A heavy silence settled over the group. No more arguments, no more denial. Just the quiet understanding that whatever was happening beneath them was bigger than any of them. Ethan didn't wait for questions. He turned immediately, scanning the ground again, recalculating with every second that passed. The rods he'd planted shifted slightly, subtle but enough to confirm what he already suspected. The spread was accelerating. "We don't have much time," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Marianne stepped closer, her voice steadier now, but not because she had control. Because she needed it. "What do you need?" she asked. It was the first time she'd asked him anything without authority behind it. Ethan noticed, but he didn't acknowledge it. Not yet. "Weight needs to be redistributed," he said. "Pressure points are uneven. That's what's causing the collapse to spread." A man blinked. In English? Ethan exhaled once. "Too much weight is sitting on unstable ground," he simplified. "Your houses, your driveways, all of it is pressing down on something that can't hold anymore." A woman shook her head. "So what, we just stand here and watch everything sink?" "No," Ethan said. Then he pointed, quick, decisive. "You start moving anything heavy away from the slope. Cars first. Keep them centered. Spread them out." People hesitated again, but not out of doubt, out of fear. Because now they understood enough to know this was serious. Marianne turned sharply. "You heard him," she said, her voice snapping back into something closer to command, but different now. Less arrogance, more urgency. "Move the cars now." That did it. Doors opened, engines started. Tires rolled cautiously across the fractured street as residents repositioned vehicles toward the center. Ethan moved alongside them, directing with quick gestures, adjusting spacing, watching the ground with constant focus. Every shift mattered. Every inch. "Not there," he called to one driver. "That section's weaker, bring it back 2 feet." The man obeyed without question. Because now, they weren't listening to Marianne. They were listening to him. And she knew it. She watched as he moved through the chaos, not panicked, not overwhelmed, just precise, controlled, like he'd done this before. Like this wasn't new. Her gaze hardened, not with anger, but with something closer to realization. "You knew," she said suddenly. Ethan didn't stop moving. But he heard her. "You knew something was wrong before you even bought this house," she continued, stepping closer. "That's why you chose this one." Now he paused, just for a second. Then he looked at her. Not defensive, not proud, just honest. "I knew enough," he said. Her breath caught slightly. Enough to what? Ethan glanced toward his yard, the markers, the digging, the careful placement of everything he'd done since arriving. "Enough to watch it," he replied. The answer unsettled her more than anything else. "Watch it?" she repeated. "You bought a house here, just to watch this happen?" "No," he said quietly. A beat. to make sure it didn't get worse than it had to, that landed differently. Because now, this wasn't about him trying to belong. It wasn't about him struggling to keep up. It was about him stepping into something no one else even knew existed. Behind them, another shift rippled through the ground, less violent this time, but still present. Ethan turned immediately, checking the rods again. Still moving. Still spreading. But slower. The adjustments were working. For now, a man jogged up to him, slightly out of breath. Cars are moved. What next? Ethan looked at the slope again, then at the exposed cavity near the collapsed section, then back at the group. "We stabilize the edges," he said. "How?" the man asked. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, already mapping it out. "We need to reduce pressure along the fault line, reinforce what we can before it spreads further." The words sounded technical, but the way he said them made it clear. He had a plan, a real one. Marianne stepped forward again, this time without hesitation. "Tell us what to do," she said. And just like that, the power in the street shifted completely. And this time, no one questioned it. Not even her. Marianne stood just a step behind him now, not leading, not correcting. Listening. Watching. Waiting for direction like everyone else. Ethan didn't waste time acknowledging it. He was already moving. "Ropes," he said, grabbing the coil he'd pulled earlier. "We need tension across the weak sections, something to hold the surface from spreading further." A man frowned. "Ropes? That's not going to stop the ground from collapsing. It's not about stopping it," Ethan replied, already anchoring one end around a metal rod. "It's about controlling how it moves." That distinction mattered. And somehow they felt it. "Two people here," he pointed. "Pull tight, keep pressure steady." They moved instantly, gripping the rope, bracing their feet against the pavement. "More anchors," Ethan continued. "We need lines running parallel to the fracture, not across it." Another neighbor stepped forward. "Why parallel?" Ethan didn't slow down. "Across the line, you split it faster," he said. "Along it, you hold it together." That answer silenced any remaining doubt. Because it wasn't guesswork. It was knowledge. If you're starting to see how quickly roles can change when real skill shows up, make sure you're subscribed, because this is where everything turns. Within minutes, the street transformed. What had once been a quiet, polished neighborhood now looked like an improvised worksite. Ropes stretched across sections of pavement, rods driven into the ground at measured intervals, residents working side by side under direction they never expected to follow. And at the center of it all, he stood, not above them, not separate, but leading through action. "Keep the tension even," he called. "If one side pulls harder, it'll shift the pressure." The two men holding the first line adjusted immediately. "Like this?" one asked. Ethan stepped closer, checking the angle, the strain. "Yeah, hold it there." His voice stayed calm, focused, even as another low rumble passed beneath them. The ground didn't crack this time, didn't split further. It resisted, just slightly, but enough. A woman noticed it first. "It's not moving as much," she said, her voice tentative. Others looked down, watching the fractures closely. She was right. The spreading had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. And that changed everything. Marianne exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. "You're actually stabilizing it," she said, almost to herself. Ethan didn't respond. He was already setting the next line, adjusting the spacing between anchors, calculating the next pressure point. Because slowing it down wasn't the goal. It was just buying time. "More rods over here," he said, gesturing toward the slope. "That's where it's weakest." A few residents hesitated at the edge, glancing toward the exposed cavity. It looked worse now. Darker. Deeper. More real. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "It's stable for now," he said, "but not for long. If we don't reinforce that side—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They moved, carefully, cautiously. But they moved. Even Marianne stepped closer to the edge this time, heels digging into uneven ground as she watched the process unfold. Her eyes shifted from the rods to the ropes to the man orchestrating all of it with nothing but instinct and experience. "You didn't learn this fixing houses," she said quietly. Ethan drove another rod into the soil, testing its hold before securing the line. "No," he replied. She studied him for a moment longer. "Then where?" He paused, just briefly. Then tightened the rope, pulling it into place. "Somewhere people didn't listen," he said. The answer sat heavy between them, because now she understood what that meant. This wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this. It wasn't even the first time he'd tried to stop it. A distant crack echoed again, but softer this time. Contained. Controlled. The system he was building, simple, improvised, almost invisible to anyone who didn't understand it, was working. For now. A man jogged over, slightly breathless. Everything set on this side. What else? Ethan looked across the entire stretch again, eyes moving quickly, mapping it all out one more time. Then he pointed toward the far end of the slope. "That's where it started," he said, "and that's where it'll keep pushing from." The man frowned. "So what do we do?" Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "We reinforce it," he said. A pause. "Then? Or it takes everything with it." That wasn't a warning anymore. It was a line drawn. And everyone standing there could feel it. The ground had quieted, but not because the danger had passed. Because something was holding it back. Barely. Ethan stood at the edge of the slope, staring down at the exposed section where the earth had given way. The cavity beneath was clearer now, wider than before, stretching deeper into darkness that swallowed light too quickly. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was confirming. "This is the source," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Marianne stepped beside him, her voice lower now, stripped of the authority she once carried so easily. "How bad is it?" she asked. Ethan didn't look at her right away. Instead, he crouched and picked up a broken piece of stone, turning it in his hand like he was reading something written into it. "Bad enough that this whole neighborhood shouldn't have been built here," he said. The words landed harder than anything before. Because this wasn't temporary, this wasn't fixable in the way they wanted, it was foundational. Behind them, the ropes held. The rods remained steady. The fractures hadn't spread further, but they hadn't healed either. They waited, pressured, contained. Then why didn't anyone say anything? A man asked, his voice tight with frustration. Ethan stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. "Someone probably did," he said. That answer hung in the air, uncomfortable, incomplete. Marianne's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" she pressed. Ethan turned toward her now. "For something like this to exist," he said, gesturing toward the cavity, "it doesn't just appear overnight. There were signs, reports, warnings." A pause. They were ignored. Silence followed. Not the uneasy silence from before, a heavier one, because now the problem wasn't just beneath their feet, it was above it too. Marianne's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Not denial. Recognition. "That's not possible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "This development went through multiple approvals, high-level reviews." "Which means the warnings were buried," Ethan interrupted quietly. Her breath caught. "Or dismissed," he added. That word struck deeper than the tremors ever had. Dismissed. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about the ground failing, it was about decisions. people. Power. A man stepped forward, running a hand through his hair. So what, you're saying this was known? That someone built all of this anyway? Ethan didn't answer directly. He didn't need to, because the evidence was already there, cracking beneath their feet. Marianne took a step back, her gaze drifting across the neighborhood, the homes, the street, everything she had spent years building, managing, protecting. All of this, she murmured. It can't just collapse. Ethan followed her gaze. It doesn't collapse all at once, he said. It fails in stages. That word again. Failing. And right now, they were in the middle of it. A faint shift moved beneath them again, small, contained, but enough to remind everyone that time wasn't on their side. Ethan turned back toward the group. We've slowed it, he said. But this isn't a solution. It's a delay. A woman stepped forward. Then, what's the solution? Ethan's eyes moved back to the slope, to the cavity, to the place where everything had started. We expose it, he said. The group exchanged uncertain looks. Expose what? Someone asked. Ethan pointed downward. All of it, he said. The void, the structure, whatever's underneath, if we don't relieve the pressure from below, it'll keep pushing upward. A man frowned. You're saying we dig it out? Ethan nodded once. Controlled excavation, he clarified. Not random, not rushed, but enough to release the stress before it forces its own way out. The idea sounded insane. Digging into an already unstable ground. But at this point, so did everything else. Marianne looked at him again, searching his face, not for doubt, but for certainty, and she found it. You're sure? She asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. No, he said. That caught her off guard. Then he added, but I know it's the only option left. That honesty did more than confidence ever could. Because now they trusted him, not because he promised control, but because he didn't pretend to have it. Another distant crack echoed, but it didn't spread. The ropes held, the rods held, the system held, but barely. Ethan stepped forward again, eyes locked on the slope. Get me shovels, he said. No hesitation this time, no questions. People moved instantly, running toward garages, sheds, anywhere tools could be found. Because now, the neighborhood wasn't waiting to be saved, it was working to survive. And at the center of it all, the man they laughed at that morning was the only reason they still had a chance. The man they laughed at that morning was now the only one holding everything together. Shovels hit the ground within minutes, not carelessly, not chaotically, under direction. Not there, Ethan said immediately, stepping in as one resident drove a shovel too close to the fracture line. You cut into that section, it'll collapse faster. Work from the edges, always from the edges, inward. They adjusted instantly. Because now, every move mattered. The slope had become the focal point, a fragile boundary between what was holding and what was waiting to give way. The exposed cavity beneath it loomed darker than before, stretching deeper than anyone had realized. Ethan stepped down carefully toward it, boots pressing into unstable soil with measured control. Keep the tension steady, he called back toward the ropes. If that slackens even a little, we lose the surface. I've got it. One of the men shouted, tightening his grip. Others followed suit, bracing themselves, holding the fragile system together as digging began. Shovel after shovel carved into the earth, not randomly, but guided. Controlled. Each scoop removing just enough weight to relieve pressure without triggering collapse. Ethan watched every movement, corrected angles, adjusted spacing, calculated constantly. Because this wasn't digging, it was surgery. Marianne stood at the edge, no longer concerned with appearances, her heels now coated in dirt as she watched the process unfold. This shouldn't be possible, she said quietly. Ethan didn't look up. It wasn't supposed to be necessary, he replied. That distinction hit her harder than she expected, because now she understood this wasn't just a natural failure. It was a failure that had been allowed to happen. Ethan, she said, using his name for the first time. He paused slightly, but didn't stop working. You said someone ignored warnings, she continued. How do you know that? He drove the shovel into the soil again, deeper this time, exposing more of the underlying structure, a fragmented layer of old reinforcement, cracked, incomplete. Then he stepped back, and finally looked at her. Because I wrote one of those warnings, he said. The words didn't come with drama. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was enough. Marianne's breath caught. You? What? Years seemed to pass in the space between those two words. Ethan turned back toward the exposed layer, brushing away loose dirt with his hand. This area was flagged before construction started, he said. Unstable ground. Incomplete reinforcement plans. Risk of subsurface failure. A man nearby froze mid-motion. Wait, you're saying this was documented? Ethan nodded once. Detailed reports, he said. Recommendations for deeper structural support. Warnings about long-term collapse risk if it wasn't addressed. Marianne shook her head slowly. That doesn't make sense, she said. Developers wouldn't ignore something like that, not at this level. Ethan let out a quiet breath. They don't ignore it, he said. A pause. They reclassify it. The implication hit instantly. Reworded, minimized, buried in paperwork no one reads. So you knew, Marianne said, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew this place wasn't safe, and you still came here? Ethan stood, wiping his hands again, though the dirt never really left. I knew it would hold for a while, he said. Long enough for someone to notice if they were looking. And you were, she said. He didn't answer. Because the truth was already clear. I tried to stop it before, he added quietly. Different site. Same kind of failure. The air shifted again, not with fear this time, but with understanding. And? One of the residents asked cautiously. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. No one listened, he said. That was all. But it was enough, because suddenly this wasn't just a man solving a problem. It was a man finishing something he'd already failed to prevent once before. A low rumble passed beneath them again, but softer. Controlled. The excavation was working. The pressure was releasing, slowly, carefully, just enough to ease the strain on the surface above. Keep going, Ethan said, his voice steady. We're getting there. Shovels moved faster now, not reckless, but more confident. Because they could feel it. The ground wasn't fighting them as hard anymore. The fractures weren't widening. The system was holding. Marianne stepped closer to the exposed cavity, staring down into the darkness beneath everything she thought she understood. All this time she murmured. We were standing on this. Ethan glanced at her briefly. Yeah, he said. Then added, most people don't question what's under them. Until it gives way, that silence returned again. But this time, it wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with truth. And truth didn't shake the ground. It reshaped everything standing on it. The excavation continued, but something had shifted beyond the physical now. The panic was gone. The chaos had settled into purpose. Every person on that street, every homeowner who had once measured worth by appearances, was now working side by side, following the direction of the one man they had dismissed. Ethan didn't slow down. Careful on that edge, he called, stepping in as a section of loosened soil began to crumble too quickly. He adjusted the angle of the dig, redistributing weight with a few precise movements. You release it too fast, it collapses. Steady, keep it steady. The man nodded, correcting immediately. They trusted him now. completely. Not because he demanded it, because he'd earned it. Another section of earth gave way, but this time it didn't trigger a chain reaction. The collapse stayed contained, the pressure beneath easing instead of building. A ripple moved through the group. Hope. Small. Fragile. But real. Marianne stood just behind the line of workers, no longer apart from them. The dirt on her hands, the strain in her posture, it all told a different story than the one she'd been living hours ago. She watched him closely, not with skepticism, with clarity. "You were right," she said quietly. Ethan didn't look up, not immediately. Because this wasn't about being right. It never had been, but after a moment he stepped back from the edge, scanning the site again, confirming what he already felt. The ground had stabilized, not permanently, not completely, but enough. "For now," he said. Marianne nodded slowly. "For now," she repeated. The words carried weight, but also something else. Acceptance. Around them, the neighborhood began to settle, not physically, but emotionally. The tension that had gripped every movement started to ease. Conversations returned, quieter now, more thoughtful. A man approached Ethan, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I owe you an apology," he said. "We all do." Ethan shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me anything," he replied. But the man didn't move. "Yeah, we do," he said. Others began to gather, not crowding, not overwhelming, but present, acknowledging, because they remembered the looks, the comments, the assumptions, and now they saw him clearly. Marianne stepped forward again, this time without hesitation. Her voice didn't carry authority anymore. It carried responsibility. "This neighborhood exists because of decisions I supported," she said, her gaze fixed on the fractured ground. Decisions I didn't question enough. Ethan watched her carefully, not judging, just listening. "I trusted the reports in front of me," she continued. "The approvals, the assurances. I didn't think to ask what might have been left out." A pause. Then she looked at him. "And you did?" Ethan didn't respond. "Because the truth didn't need reinforcement. It won't happen again," she said. That wasn't a promise to him. It was a promise to herself. And this time, it sounded different. Behind them, one of the residents called out. The cracks, they're not spreading anymore. Heads turned instantly. Eyes scanned the pavement, the driveways, the slope. He was right. The fractures had stopped advancing. The system held. Relief moved through the group like a wave, quiet, steady, earned. Ethan exhaled slowly, the first real release of tension since it had begun. But even then, his eyes stayed on the ground, because he knew better than to assume it was over. "It'll need proper reinforcement," he said. "Engineering, deep structural work. This," he gestured to the ropes, the rods, the excavation, "this just bought you time." Marianne nodded. "We'll do it right this time," she said. Ethan studied her for a moment, and for the first time, he believed her. Not because of her position, but because of what she'd just gone through. The street looked different now, not broken, changed. The perfection was gone, but in its place was something more honest, more real. Lily stepped out from the house then, walking carefully toward him, her eyes wide as she took in everything that had happened. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Ethan crouched beside her, brushing dirt from her sleeve. "For now," he said. She nodded, accepting it the way she always did, without fear, because she trusted him. And now, so did everyone else. And now, so did everyone else. The street that once echoed with quiet judgment now carried something entirely different. Respect, not loud, not forced, but undeniable. The ropes still stretched across sections of pavement, the rods still held their positions in the soil, and the exposed earth near the slope remained a stark reminder of what lay beneath. But the panic was gone, replaced by something steadier, Awareness. Marianne stood at the center of it all, no longer elevated above the others, no longer separated by status or control. Just another person standing on ground that had nearly failed her. "We'll bring in engineers first thing," she said, addressing the group not as a command, but as a commitment. Independent ones. Full inspection. No shortcuts. This time, no one questioned her. Because this time, she wasn't protecting appearances, she was protecting truth. Ethan stood a few steps away, watching quietly as the neighborhood began to reorganize itself, not around power, but around understanding. People spoke differently now. Softer. More deliberate. A man approached him again, offering a firm nod. "You saved all of this," he said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "We did, and that mattered. Because it wasn't just his skill that held the ground together. It was what happened after they chose to listen." Lily stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his again. She looked out at the street, at the neighbors who had once turned away from them, now looking back with something closer to gratitude. "They're not staring the same way anymore," she said quietly. Ethan glanced down at her, then back at the group. "No," he said. "They're seeing," she added. He gave a small nod. "Yeah, they are." Across the street, Marianne took a slow step forward, stopping just short of him. There was no hesitation this time, no pride to protect. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. Ethan met her gaze, not guarded, not distant, just steady. "You owe the truth more than anything," he replied. She nodded. "I intend to give it," she said. And something about the way she said it made the moment settle, not as an ending, but as a turning point. Because this wasn't just about a neighborhood anymore. It was about what people chose to ignore, and what happened when someone refused to. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the cracked pavement. The damage was still there, visible, undeniable, but it no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of understanding. Ethan walked back toward his yard, stopping near the patch of ground he'd started digging that morning, the same spot that had drawn so much ridicule just hours ago. Now, it made sense. He looked down at it, then out across the street, at the homes, the people, the space between them that no longer felt divided. He hadn't come here to prove anything. He hadn't come here to belong. He came because he knew. Because he'd seen what happened when warnings were ignored. And this time, he made sure they weren't. Lily tugged lightly at his hand. "Are we still staying?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, then back at the neighborhood, then down at the ground beneath it all. "Yeah," he said, "we are." Because now, they weren't just living there, they were understood there. And the house, the cheapest one on the block, the one everyone mocked, stood exactly where it needed to be. Not as a mistake, but as the one place someone had been willing to look deeper. This wasn't a story about a cheap house. It was about what happens when someone sees what others refuse to. Ask me for the next story title and I'll bring it to life. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. The janitor they mocked was the only one who could open the vault. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?